Creepypasta are great, but does anyone have any good true creepy stories? Story 1. A few years ago my brother would get a call on his cell phone around 2 to 3 a.m. every night. He would answer and it was this hellish sounding noise. Like static mixed with screams. He changed his cell number after a month of this and it stopped. Then after a week or so it began again. The exact same noise. Exact same time. Finally one day he decided to backdial the call. It was an old man that had no clue what he was talking about. Still the calls persisted. If he didn't answer, it would call a few more times. No messages were left. He decided to say screw it. Ended his contract with his phone company, switched to a new one, and then got another new number. You guessed it, the screaming static calls continued after a short delay. By this time he was terrified every night. Unsure why this was happening. He backdialed the number again and got a different person. Around this time he lost his job and his phone. The calls stopped of course. His phone was disconnected now. So one day my mom asks me to listen to this weird message she got on our home phone. It was the static screaming. We showed my brother and he was freaking out. He backdialed the number again and it said the number was disconnected this time. Never heard from it again after that. Story 2. This happened to a friend of mine, she told me about it a year or so ago. We'll call her Minji. Minji is in her late 20s and works as an English tutor in South Korea. One evening, a few years ago, she was tutoring a high school boy. They were up studying pretty late and the buses stopped running. Being a long way from his house, the boy asked if he could crash on her floor overnight and get the first bus the next morning. Minji was very reluctant, because inviting a teenage male student to stay the night didn't sound like a great idea, but he was begging her and eventually she relented. They went back to her one-room apartment, and she got into the bed, while he laid a blanket out on the floor, and they both fell asleep. A few hours later, at maybe 2 a.m., the boy wakes Minji up. I'm really hungry, he says, let's go get some food. Minji opens her eyes and looks up at him in disbelief. Food? Now. It's 2 a.m., go back to bed. But the student insists, no, I'm so hungry, let's eat something now. She tells him that there's some ramen in the kitchen, and he can fix himself some. This doesn't satisfy him, he doesn't want ramen, there's a 24-hour place just down the road, let's go there. Eventually, after several minutes of persuasion, the boy gets Minji to come with him to the restaurant. They leave the apartment and head out. As soon as they're on the street, the boy turns to Minji and says, I'm not hungry. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked under your bed. There's a man sleeping there. They call the police and discover that a homeless man had been living in Minji's apartment, sleeping under her bed, for over 2 months. The boy only saw him because he was lying on her floor, so had a clear view under the bed. The police arrested the man, and thankfully there were no other issues, but that's by far the creepiest thing that's ever happened to anyone I know. Story 3. None from me, but I remember a story a high school teacher told me that always stuck with me. My former teacher was home alone when she was a child, at some point in the 70s probably. A man knocked on her door and she opened her main door but kept her screen door locked. He said he was from the gas company and wanted to talk to her parents. She told him they weren't home and he, without missing a beat, tried to start forcing his way into the home. When he found the screen door to be locked, he pulled out a box cutter and started to cut through the screen. My teacher ran to hide in a clothes hamper in her parents' closet. She said she sat there for about 10 minutes before the police arrived. Thank God a neighbor saw everything and called the police, or she probably would be dead. Also, to put the cherry on the freaking creepy sundae, they found the intruder hiding in the attic. She told us that as a cautionary tale to lock all doors and windows when home alone. Of course, naturally, I would go home from school to be alone for hours. Doom. Story 4. My grandfather died last year sometime when my son was maybe a year old. We had dinner with the whole family every Friday night, so my son had seen him several times. My grandfather was a very quiet, proud man, but when he thought he was alone or unseen he would make silly faces at my son to get a laugh. A couple nights after his funeral, my son, who liked to crawl into bed with us in the middle of the night, started just laughing uncontrollably at like 2 a.m. So I get out of bed to see what's going on, and find my son sitting in the middle of the living room, in the dark, laughing. I say, "Hey buddy, what are you doing?" In toddler speak he says, "Papa, funny." I got a little nervous for some reason and went to pick him up and bring him to our room for the rest of the night. And as I'm hauling him away he says, "Bye Papa," and blows a kiss at absolutely nothing I can see. Story 5. A few weeks ago my girlfriend and I were sleeping together, when I woke up to her saying, "What are you doing?" She sometimes talks in her sleep, but this sounded so coherent and urgent that it jolted me awake and I asked what she was talking about. She then woke up and said she thought she saw someone at the end of the bed. Thinking it was just a dream or semi-awake hallucination, we thought nothing of it and went back to sleep. About an hour later, I woke up and saw someone standing on the bed, with the sheets wrapped up and twisted to their neck. I didn't know what to do, but the first thing that came out of my mouth was, "What are you doing?" My girlfriend then woke me up. I had been dreaming the exact same thing that she did, and said the exact same thing. I know it's the power of suggestion or whatever, but screw that. Story 6. When I was in 8th grade I went on a school trip that was called the Louisiana Tour. It was mostly going around to significant sites in South Louisiana. One of the places we went was Myrtle's Plantation, which is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the country. There are all kinds of stories about the place, but at one point we were standing in a room as a part of a larger group and the tour guide was talking about something, I don't remember what. As I'm standing there I start to hear what sounds like someone hitting a piano key. After I heard it a couple of times I started to look around for the source of the noise. I didn't see a piano, but I kept hearing it. So I asked my friends who were standing near me if they heard it, they said no. When I heard it again I said there is it again and that they must have heard it. They thought I was crazy. So I went back to looking around the room. Everyone's eyes were on the tour guide except for one woman. She caught my eye and pointed at me and then at her ear with a questioning look. I realized she was asking if I heard it too and I nodded. At this point the tour guide starts telling a story about a soldier who had died there and that he played the piano and multiple guests had reported hearing him playing in the night. I honestly didn't know what to think, I guess I still don't. I talked to the woman as we were all leaving the room and she had heard the exact same thing as me, but her husband and son had not heard it. Story 7. I work at the Myrtle's Plantation and I have so many of these stories and events that visitors tell me. The creepiest is one in my opinion is that you can sleep at the plantation kind of like a bed and breakfast, while we have a room that is filled with those creepy ceramic dolls. There is one doll though that was one of the children's favorite and always was in the bed with her at night. The child later died, too long to explain, and the doll stayed on the bed with her. When we started to house guests at the Myrtles we kept the doll on the bed in memory of the child. The first night when someone slept in the room they moved the doll to get more comfortable. In the morning the doll was back in the bed with its hands on the guest's throat. She came out outraged accusing us that we did something in her room. No one went in or out of her room that night at all. The next guest moved the doll as well and when he was sleeping he heard tapping on the wood floors. He woke up and noticed the doll on the floor where the sound was coming from. Everyone who stays in the room and moves the doll will come and go back in its bed. Story 8. I posted this story before to another thread a while ago, but this seems like the perfect place for it, and it's fairly short, so here it is. When I was growing up one of my best friends told me about a very creepy situation involving him, his younger brother, and a man in the window. When my friend and his little brother were younger they shared a bedroom. They're some years apart, but his younger brother was born with a multitude of different health issues, including multiple sclerosis, and he's confined to a wheelchair and cannot care for himself. So, to keep an eye on him overnight when his parents couldn't, they shared a bedroom. One night my friend randomly woke up for no in particular reason and happened to glance over at his younger brother, but noticed something very startling, a strange silhouette of a man wearing a top hat looking in through the window behind his younger brother's crib. The first thing my friend did was jump up and turn the light on, then ran into his parents' room to tell them what he saw. When his parents came back into their room to investigate, his younger brother was having a seizure in his crib. A few of his family members say it was his younger brother's guardian angel standing in the window that night. My friend believes it was death. It's all still pretty unsettling to me. Story 9. When I was younger, I had an imaginary friend who lived in this massive antique dresser. We'd chill out and I vividly remember him telling me stories, although I have absolutely no recollection of what they actually were. I remember one day talking to my parents about it. Dad traveled quite a bit, so he wasn't up to date with what I was into, and when I started telling him about my dresser buddy, he wanted to know his name. It was something innocent like Peter or Patrick, but I can still see him going white in the face. I drew Peter/Patrick out for him, and the very next day him and my uncle took out that dresser and burned it. It wasn't until a few years later when I found out my dad's little brother, my uncle, also had the same friend with the same name who lived in the same antique dresser. After a few months of the typical imaginary friend crap, my uncle started having night terrors and couldn't sleep because of Peter/Patrick. It got so bad that they had to move him out of his room before he managed to get back to normal. Story 10. When my son was about 3, he had an imaginary friend in his room who he used to talk to all the time. He would tell us stories about things she would tell him, and we'd hear him chatting to her at bedtime. We thought it was pretty cute. After a few months, my son said he wasn't friends with her anymore. We figured he was over his phase of seeing her, so we're surprised to hear him still talking to her at night. Then he started not wanting to go to bed and having really bad dreams. At some point we ended up asking a lot of questions about her. We had assumed she was a little girl, but apparently she was 47. She lived in the wall, and he stopped being friends with her because she wanted him to call her mommy. Her name was something like Margaret. She wanted him to come and live in the wall with her. He had told her he didn't want to talk to her anymore, and she wouldn't go away. We eventually moved house, and he stopped talking about her. Funny thing is, when I was pregnant with him, living in the same house, I used to have dreams about a lady sitting at a dining table in our bedroom, except it was obviously a different era, and the room was not a bedroom at the time. The lady used to knit and make me listen to her giving me parenting advice, while her 2 20-ish-year-old sons sat at the table quietly. Story 11. About a couple weeks after I was born, my dad's best friend, Jim, died. They were really close, and one of the last things he wanted was to hold little me before he passed. His wish was filled, and some short time after that he was gone. Fast forward 7 years. I'm now a happy 7-year-old with a 5-year-old brother and recently born sister. One day the phone rings, and with my mom out and dad in the washroom, I thought it was going to be ignored as we kids were still too young to answer the phone. No call display. We didn't know if there would be a stranger. But my brother broke the rules and answered. Hello? At this point my dad is out of the washroom and is asking my brother to hand him the phone. He ignores him and keeps listening to whoever is speaking. Before my dad could ask a second time, my brother hangs up, looks at him and says, "Jim says hi," and he misses Skywing Nova, then goes back to playing. The look of shock my dad had is what I remember most about this. Story 12. I was once featured in a St. Jude Survivor newsletter when I was about 5 years old in the early 90s. The newsletter went out across the country and apparently into Canada. There was this guy named Mitchell that called my family up out of the blue because he had read my cancer survival story. He lived somewhere in Canada and claimed to be this big-time Christian and wanted to talk to me God in prayer. My mom let him talk to me for whatever reason, and the guy actually just wanted to talk to me about Alf. This Canadian dude named Mitchell was obsessed with Alf and somehow got a hold of our mailing address and sent me tons of Alf merchandise, coloring books, pencils, Alf everything. For some reason, my parents let him talk to me whenever he would call because they bought into his God stuff and liked how he sent me Elf crap. This went on and off for about a year until he asked me if I had ever heard of John Wayne Gacy. He told me who he was and that he had escaped him when Gacy tried kidnapping him when he was a kid. He told me I should tell my parents they shouldn't trust strangers because you never know who you could really be talking to. I remember he didn't sound menacing when he said it, just matter of fact. Of course my parents freaked when I told them that, and they changed numbers and called the police. They never really did anything since the guy did live in Canada by all accounts and hadn't really threatened me. Also, keep in mind Mitchell somehow had our mailing address and knew exactly where we lived. We had plans on moving soon anyway though. Fast forward 10 years to about 2001. We live in a new house, a new state, everything unlisted. I'm now 15. What did we get in the mail? Yes, you guessed it, Alf coloring book. Story 13. Hard to say what qualifies as creepy. It could maybe be seen as heartwarming. I don't know. My mother swears this is a true story, and frankly, I don't see why she would lie about it. My mom had 3 kids. There's me, the youngest, and my older brother, but before either of us were born, there was Jonathan. He was a sweet little blonde boy, big blue eyes, known for accidentally repeating Dad's swears in church. Wholesome kid, great in school, active outside. When he was almost 6, he was riding his bike and fell and hit his head on a rock. He got up and said he felt fine. My mom found him the next morning in his bed when she tried to wake him up to get to kindergarten, one pupil dilated and the other not. She got him airlifted to the nearest hospital. During this time, Jonathan's best friend Nick was sitting at the breakfast table eating cereal. Nick suddenly gets up from the table and goes to the door. When his mom asks him what's up, Nick says that Johnny was calling for him. You see, Nick and Johnny lived on separate blocks, but they weren't allowed to cross the street without a parent yet because they were still fairly young. But they lived close enough to call to one another to come out to talk at their respective street corners. So Nick goes out to the street corner while his mother receives a call from mine that Johnny was just declared dead in the hospital, idle brain aneurysm that was triggered by the fall. Nick's mom can hardly handle this news and is now wondering where her son went. But Nick comes back a few minutes later and says that he heard Johnny calling to him but he wasn't at the street corner when he looked, then sits down to continue eating his cereal. When his mom asks Nick what Johnny was saying, Nick says he had come to say goodbye. My mom told me this story when I was young, but it stuck with me. I wish I could have met him. But truthfully, I wouldn't be here to type this story to all you random strangers if he hadn't died. My mother only wanted 2 kids. I'm thankful for the chance I was given to live, and feel like he died for me sometimes. I'm not religious, but I do feel spiritual when I think of Johnny. Obligatory edit, I submitted this in between classes and am legitimately surprised to see it was read by more than one person. Thanks for reading a part of Johnny's story. It's scary to think of a little trigger in your brain just waiting to be set off to end, but my parents said if they had known, it was the 80s and there was no reason to suspect such a thing would be an issue for such a bright, energetic boy, Johnny wouldn't have gotten to do all the fun things he ended up doing, playing baseball, climbing trees, and just being a kid. And that would have been like having no life at all. Story 14. Weird one that happened to my sister a couple years ago. Background info, she and her, now, husband are house sitting for my brother-in-law's uncle. The uncle is old and starting to lose it. He rents out a basement suite and a nice lady lives downstairs. She cleans the house when she is there, but he wanted my brother-in-law to come check on things and feed his old cat once in a while. Okay, so first day they go to house sit, they get in but can't find the cat to make sure it's okay. My sister has cats and know they like to hide when they are dying, so they are all worried and are looking everywhere for this cat. In all rooms, under the beds and everything. Even check with the lady downstairs, she hasn't seen it. So my sister opens up the closet in the spare bedroom and is looking around stuff on the floor. Moves a couple of things and sees a set of feet on the ground in the closet, with clothes blocking anything above the feet. The feet have nicely painted toenails and look human, but she assumes it is a doll or something. They look in a few more places and all of a sudden the cat is in the middle of the living room just hanging out. So they lock the deadbolt and leave. Sister and her boyfriend go out for dinner and a movie and she can't stop thinking about the feet and how real they looked. My sister had started dating her BF fairly recently and didn't want to seem crazy, so she didn't bring it up, but a few hours into the night she decided she needed to tell him. He decides that it's probably a doll, but he offers to go back and check anyway. When they arrive, my sister will only stay on the patio because she is scared, which makes him realize that this must be something serious. They go to get in the door, but the deadbolt is now unlocked and the handle is locked. Now he thinks there must be someone in there. At the door there is a fireplace, so once he is in there he grabs the sharp poker stick from the fireplace tools and starts to sneak towards the closet. He opens the closet and sees the same set of feet with painted toenails on the floor. He pokes it lightly with the fire stick and the toes scrunch up. He proceeds to smack the foot as hard as he can with the sharp stick and yells, "Get out of there!" Out comes a lady in her mid-30s, holding the cat and a can of Coke. Turns out she was friends with the basement tenant. When she became homeless, the friend let her stay with her until she found out she was addicted to crack. Started leaving drugs around the house and had shady people coming into the house, so she kicked her out. Somehow she got a key to upstairs and had been staying there while the uncle was gone. Police were called and she was arrested. Story 15. It was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling the story, since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. To cut to the chase, the parents had spent a nice, if awkward, first date, and around the time that they would have said goodnight, the male in the situation, my friend's dad, suggested that they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place, since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in the area. So the two drove up the mouth of the canyon, got out of their cars and started hiking under just the light of the stars, since it was a new moon. At some point, the male starts getting a bad feeling, since the pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be dark, and because it was getting to be quite late. He ignores the feeling and presses on. In later rehearsings of the story, the female would say that she had felt the same feeling at what was probably the same time, though she didn't know the trail like he did. A minute later, the feeling came back to the male. He ignored it again, and started walking a bit of the way into the trees when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. Under the trees, it was too dark to see just what this soft thing was, and the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what his foot had bumped into, he and the female both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after being married for some time, they were watching an interview with the serial criminal, Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the time that he felt the closest to being caught, he explained about the night that he lured a girl into Provo Canyon, and had just ended her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in the trees just in time, only to watch some guy walk right into the body, and for some reason, just turn around and walk away. TLDR. Friend's parents stumbled onto a fresh corpse left by Ted Bundy on their first date. Story 16. That reminds me of a less spooky, more grisly event that I experienced. I used to jog through a canyon on the outskirts of my town. Train tracks ran straight down the middle of the canyon. One evening I ran my usual route closely following the train tracks. It was getting dark, but I figured I knew the route pretty well, so in the evening light I kept following the route to its end. Sometimes I'd weave off the tracks because a train was passing by. Near the end of the route I noticed a foul smell, but I figured it was just the still water that sometimes pools in the middle of the canyon. I made it home fine that evening. The next day, around midday, I ran the same route. I once again came to the end of the route, where I'd smelled the foul smell the previous night. In the middle of one of the train rails I saw a decapitated horse head. Eyes just staring wide, a bit of the spine and vertebrae showing. No blood, but a pretty strong stench. I did come close enough to confirm that yes, I was looking at some severed equine head. Maybe someone wanted to grind down horse heads into pet food or something. There were also horse trails out in the canyon. Maybe someone took their horse along the train tracks, the horse slipped and injured itself, and they couldn't move the horse before a train came by. Anyway, I made my way home a bit faster than usual. Then I stopped running that route for 2 years. Another thing to remember if you jog in somewhat wild areas, lonely bobcats, lonely feral cats, and human babies all make the same mewling cry. If you hear a baby crying, especially at night, just keep on running. And if you see a Jeep pulled over on the side of a rarely traveled path, there's an 80% chance people are in it. Story 17. I am about 98% certain I pissed on a dead guy at Seattle's Gasworks Park on a dark New Year's night at the turn of the millennium 1999 to 2000. My friend and I were gonna go see the fireworks at the Space Needle, but because terrorists had been caught sneaking tons of bombs across the Canada-American border earlier, a pre-9/11 plot to blow up LAX airport, I think, the authorities wouldn't let crowds near the Space Needle. So we went across Lake Union to watch from Gasworks Park. When the fireworks were over, it was dark and I had to piss like a racehorse. We stumbled into some bushes and I opened fly and let loose. As I was done, I started to walk away and my foot hit something soft, like a leg, and I freaked the crap out and ran. My buddy chased after me, asking me what's up, and I told him that I think I accidentally pissed on a sleeping bum. Which made him laugh, and I definitely didn't want to go back to apologize, for fear of getting the crap kicked out of me. The next morning on the news we read that a body had been found at Gasworks. I don't totally remember, but I think it was a criminal of a homeless dude. The newspaper didn't mention whether he was covered in piss or not. Story 18. My wife's mother passed away in 2003 from cancer. After the funeral, family and friends gathered at her house for a final celebration of her life. The gathering went late into the evening. My son, 3 at the time, needed to go to bed at that point. I walked with him up the stairs to where he would sleep. The room that my mother-in-law passed away in was upstairs, and straight down the hallway as you reached the top of the landing. My son and I walked upstairs together, with me holding his hand. As we nearly reached the top of the stairs, my son stopped and wouldn't move, at the point which he could just see down the hallway. He was staring straight down the hall. I looked at him, then down the hall to an open doorway to a completely dark bedroom. He just stared, and would not move any further. I asked him, "Buddy, are you okay?" His response was, "Daddy. The light. The light scares me." I looked again down the hallway where he was staring into darkness. "Buddy, you see a light?" "Yes, Daddy. It scares me." I promptly picked him up and went back downstairs. To this day, the hairs still stand on the back of my neck when I think of it. Story 19. When I was younger, my family was extremely poor and lived in a very old mobile home on some land my grandpa owned. This piece of land was in a very small town out in the middle of nowhere, Texas, and was covered in woods. The town itself was your typical small country town where football was king and there was nothing to do but get drunk or high on the weekend. It was also the type of town, along with it being early 90s, where one didn't typically have to worry too much about locking their doors or setting an alarm. Now, our trailer was a 2-bedroom and my parents, always putting us kids ahead of themselves, slept in the living room on a fold-out couch. My room was directly connected to it and my sister's room was down a hallway past the kitchen and bathroom at the other end of the trailer. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, my dad is woken up by a feeling that there is someone in the room. He looks around a bit and sees a large male figure sitting in the easy chair just feet from the bed. My dad quickly flipped on the light switch next to his bed and saw it was a neighbor from down the road named Carter. Carter was known to be a frequent drug user and was often in trouble with the law because of vice. My dad asked him what the crap he was doing here and told him to get out, and he responded, "I can't get out. The demons are chasing me and your house is the only safe one." My dad, who I should is fairly large and terrifying person, responded that if he didn't get out and get out quickly that the house would be a lot less safe for him. "If I leave they'll get me. They've been chasing me all night. If they catch me I'm dead." My dad's response was that there was no demons but that if he didn't get the crap out of his house that he'd be dead. From what I've been told, since I was asleep for this part, my mom also hurled a few threats and, while she may not be big, she was equally as terrifying. I believe it was her anger that finally scared him off. My dad got up and locked the door and watched through the blinds as Carter decided, since he couldn't outrun the demons, he'd steal our old beater Suburban that my dad always left the keys in. He drove around for about an hour. We called the police and it took them about that long to get out to us since the closest police station was about 20 or 30 minutes away. He finally brought it back and was arrested and taken to jail. He was deemed crazy and ended up locked in a mental institution. The scarier part is that for years after this we'd get phone calls where all we'd hear is music that would have lyrics like "I'm going to end you." These calls lasted for years and followed us from house to house, even though we always had different numbers and would even be in different states. We always thought it was him sending us a message. The call stopped when I was about 12. I later found out that it was around that time that Carter thought the best thing he could do for himself was soak himself in gasoline and set himself on fire. Story 20. I was at a friend's house around 12 years ago. We were in the basement watching TV, when his mom's boyfriend comes down the stairs and tells us to keep it down. We looked at each other, confused because we were literally just watching TV and it wasn't on high volume at all. We said we weren't being loud, and he said you aren't yelling, and we shook our heads. He just sort of does the hot look and tells us he and my friend's mom had heard someone screaming coming out from the furnace vents, so he thought it was coming from the basement where the furnace is. We didn't hear anything and were like 15 feet away from the furnace. Sadly, I can't verify the next story because I wasn't there, but my friend, from the basement, and another friend say they were upstairs in the kitchen one night hanging out, and they heard a scream, clear as day, coming out of one of the furnace vents. Freaked them out, naturally, but I never did get to hear it. Probably just metal creaking, but it was weird that we were so close to it and didn't hear anything that could be interpreted as a scream. Story 21. My dad used to work in a juvenile detention center in the Miami area in the early 70s. He said there was one inmate that reminded him a lot of a young Hannibal Lecter. He wasn't strong, but he was smart and very persuasive. One day he started a riot in his block of cells, just by talking the other inmates into it. My dad and another guard were sent in to check it out and try to calm things down. Everybody in the block was going crazy, banging on the bars, howling and yelling at each other. Everybody except young Hannibal Lecter. He was standing still in the middle of his cell with his arms folded, smiling and muttering the same phrase over and over, quietly. My dad tried to focus on what he was saying, and after a couple seconds he understood. The inmate was reciting my dad's home phone number. Edit, I don't know how he got it. Maybe he bribed another guard into getting it for him, or he saw it written on some form on his way between rooms or something. The guy never called my dad. In fact, he never really got any strange phone calls ever. But the level of determination this inmate must have had, all just to freak my dad out, was simply impressive. Story 22. This happened about 2 years ago to me, but it was pretty unsettling. I'll start by saying I used to have a shop in an over 100-year-old building that was split up into 3 different storefronts. I had one shop, my best friend had another, and then the third was rented to another girl. One day, I'm at the shop when the phone rings. A man is on the other line asking me for something or other and is being really spacey. I am trying to talk to him, but there are long pauses before his answers and he is just being a little odd. Finally, I ask him something and there is a long pause on the other end, long enough to make me ask, "Hello," because I think he has hung up on me. Instead he replies with, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just having a hard time focusing on our conversation because there is a spirit standing next to you that is yelling into the phone, trying to get my attention." At this point, I'm intrigued and decide to play along, so I say, "Oh really, what is he saying?" The psychic goes on to make a few broad comments about me and the space I'm in, all of which she could have easily found if he had looked on our website, so I'm not impressed, and says the man has been in the building since the early 1900s and is infatuated with me, has been following me for years, and frequently tags along with me to my house, my friends' houses, and even places like the grocery store. Okay, that's interesting, but then it gets more so. He tells me the man is very jealous of the guy that I am dating, and doesn't like him because we are so close. He then goes on to say that the spirit hurt the guy I am seeing when he was doing renovations on the building, which was 100% accurate. I put that story below, and that he didn't like that he was in his personal space changing it. So, that was weird, but his next comment really bothered me. The psychic says, "And he is very glad you broke up with that army dude. He really hated him." Now, this was weird to me because I had dated that guy about 3 years prior before and had been restationed right after we broke up and had never set foot in the building, nor had I seen him since we broke up. At the time of the phone call, I had only had my shop in the building for about 6 months, so I couldn't figure out how this spirit would know about him. The guy told me some other stuff, most of which was pretty basic, and then I finally got him off the phone because he started getting weird, and I just wasn't interested anymore. The whole conversation lasted about 15 minutes, and I was thoroughly creeped by his couple of comments and couldn't figure out how he knew so specifically the last 2 people I had dated. I should add that I don't have any personal social media that someone can search for me for, so there wouldn't have been any couple's pictures up of me with either person I dated. Then, it dawned on me. I had worked for about 6 months for my friend at her shop in the same building for some extra cash after I moved back to the city, which was about 4 years prior and in the time that I had dated/broken up with the army guy, which would also explain why the psychic said the spirit had been following me for years. I no longer have the shop in that building, but still go in there every now and then to see my friend. We both agree that building has some bad vibes, especially at night, and there's a couple more weird things that happened to me while I had the shop there. TLDR, psychic guy calls my shop and begins to tell me all about the spirit who lives there and is in love with me and hates all the guys I date. Asterisk so, before I opened the shop, the guy I was seeing at the time agreed to help me put ceiling lights up, which involved having to go into the attic. Now, the attic, like in any old building, was nasty, so I bought him one of those industrial dust suits to wear and a mask so he wouldn't be breathing in asbestos and whatever else was up there. He's up in the attic and I'm on the floor underneath, and we are communicating through this little hole that we are installing the light into, when I hear him yell, and then his voice gets really rushed and agitated, like he is irritated with me that I'm taking too long. So, finally, about 10 minutes later, we get the light up and he comes barreling down the steps to the attic and flings the door shut. He looks really freaked out and begins ripping off the dust suit and pulls up his shirt. On his left side are 3 long claw marks/scratches, running the length of his side, one of which was bleeding. We look at the dust suit, no scratches through it, so he didn't get caught on something, and the scratches were too widely spaced to have been a rodent's, plus he hasn't seen anything when he was up there. According to him, he had felt weird up there to begin with, but the last light we were installing was all the way in the back corner of the attic, and he was lying on his stomach feeding me the cords down the little hole when he felt what felt like a whip go across his side. Story 23. I'll try to get through this without breaking down. It's still kind of chilling to think about. Around the time I was 19, I was deployed to Iraq. My unit worked with bombs, and honestly, I didn't know I would make it home intact. About halfway through my tour, the Red Cross notified my unit that my father was terminally ill. Within a week, I was on a plane back to the States. Now my dad being ill was something I had grown used to. He was strong though, and I never expected to actually lose him. I lost my mother when I was 7, and my father's lungs had collapsed shortly before then. He was on oxygen and needed a wheelchair to go anywhere. Medication by the handfuls were needed every few hours. He gained weight from limited movement, developed diabetes, and had already beaten cancer once. I never expected to lose him, and he wasn't the type to ever give up. I arrive home, head to the hospital, and he assures me he's fine and they're overreacting. I visit him every day I'm there, but he tells me he'll be fine by the time I get home for good. I reluctantly go back overseas. I call his hospital whenever I have a few minutes of free time and we're near a call center. My deployment finishes, and he kept his promise. He comes home from the hospital, because he says he doesn't want to die there. He gets worse, and goes back. The family all visits, but we know he isn't improving. One day I'm at home and the phone rings. It's an unknown number, so I don't answer. It goes to the answering machine, and a very raspy voice mumbles, "Call the hospital." It's my dad. I grab the phone, but he already hung up. So I call. They tell me he's been intubated for the past couple hours and he just started going into cardiac arrest. He's non-responsive, and we need to come say our goodbyes. I argue that he just called me, and she says that's not possible. They've been working on him for some time now. I hung up and told my family the news. My sister and I stared at the answering machine. We played the tape again and again. That was the last time I heard my father's voice. I'm a skeptic. I don't believe in the paranormal or ghosts, and I cannot come up with any logical explanation. I still get watery-eyed thinking about it. Story 24. I was visiting family for winter break in Los Angeles. This was about 5 years ago. I was heading to the bathroom on the second floor of my aunt's house when I saw my cousin, April, on the stairs. April was 4 and very animated. She was busy making funny faces while sitting on the stairs. I asked her what she was doing. She said, "I'm copying the lady with the braid." I looked around, there was no one else but us. I asked, "Where is the lady, April?" She pointed to a beam running parallel to the stairwell. I asked April, "What is the lady doing?" She said, "Making funny faces." I smiled and started walking up the stairs again when April said something that stopped me in my tracks. April, her braids is around her neck. I turned back and asked April to repeat herself. April pointed, "The lady is hanging by her braid. She's making funny faces." Then April started making a face which I then realized was at someone gasping for air. Story 25. One of my brothers worked security in one of New York City's most upscale hotels. The security desk received a frantic call during one of his night shifts. A guy was calling, all freaked out that his wife was in the bath and was not breathing. My brother and another security guard rushed upstairs to the room. Sure enough, they found a woman in the tub, and she was unresponsive. My brother and the other guard got her out of the tub and attempted CPR. In the interim, during resuscitation attempts, the NYPD arrived. They told my brother to stop CPR because the lady was obviously dead and, in their opinion, had been for a couple of hours. The husband was questioned extensively. He told law enforcement that he and his wife had a fight earlier in the evening. He went out on his own, and when he came back, his wife was in the bath. He says he went to bed at that point but later became concerned when his wife didn't come to bed. Privately, among all those present, the general consensus was that the husband had something to do with it, but it could not be proven. A couple of weeks later, the room was again made available to guests, and of course the incident was not mentioned. A woman who frequently stayed at the hotel made a reservation for a week and was assigned to that room. She was the first person to stay in the room since the incident. She came to the front desk first thing in the morning, very upset, and with all of her luggage in tow. She said that she was canceling the rest of her reservation and that she would never be staying in the hotel again. She said that she did not sleep the entire night and that the room was haunted. No one at the hotel had mentioned to her what had previously transpired in the room. While my brother worked there, every guest who stayed in the room called about strange things and many asked to be switched to another room. Story 26. I should start off by saying my brother is not only a military man, but he's your basic hetero never let them see you cry cliché of a military man. He's not afraid of anything, well, except for the entire country of Japan. This is his story. My brother joined the Marines when he was 18 and was stationed in Japan. He really enjoyed his time there for a while. The girls, specifically. He made friends with some of the Japanese guys his age who worked around the base. On nights where him and his soldier friends had the night off, the local Japanese guys would show them around, bring them to bars, introduce them to girls, etc. One night, after a little drinking and no luck with girls, the guy invited my brother home to play video games. My brother accepted the invite and they played video games for a few hours. During this time, he tells my brother the main reason he wanted to get home early was because his little sister had been suffering from night terrors, causing her to wake up screaming, crying, and sometimes vomiting. He was worried about her and wanted to be home in case she had an episode. At this point in the story, I should explain how this guy's house was shaped. The house was built in the shape of a horseshoe, with a garden in the middle. His bedroom was at the very edge of one side of the U-shape and his sister's all the way at the other end. So they are essentially across the garden from each other. If he looks out of his window, he can see into hers and vice versa. So anyways, they decide to call it a night, and the Japanese guy walks over to the window to look across the garden into his sister's window, to check on her. He lifts the blind and peers out for a fraction of a second before jumping back screaming and looking at my brother like he just saw something horrible. My brother then goes to look and he stops him. He tells him that he saw a dark cloud with red eyes hovering over his sister's sleeping body. My brother, naturally, does not believe him and decides to look for himself. He creeps quietly over to the window and lifts the blind, but this time, he finds himself eye to eye with what he describes as a dark black puff of smoke with a face. My brother and this other guy admit that they got under the guy's covers and stayed there until it was light outside, too afraid to lift the blankets and see that the smoky figure had come a little closer, and was in the room with them, just on the other side of the thin sheets. I don't know what to believe, or if maybe they drank more than what they said they did that night and imagined it all, but I know my brother believes what he saw. He sticks to his story, and when he tells it, he looks like someone who saw something truly sinister. Edit: my brother isn't gay. He is probably the least likely to be gay person on earth. If you think he handled the situation badly, next time your reality comes crashing down and you go from not believing in ghosts to seeing one with your own eyes, let us know how you handled it. It's easy to sound brave when it didn't happen to you. Story 27. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but I've had one experience that I just can't explain. So it was about a year ago when I had my paranormal encounter. I had just woke up with a case of morning wood that would not go away, so the only option at that point was to smack around the old one-eyed monster. It's important to note that my dad and I had just moved into this old, fixer-upper, house and the bathroom was the only room with a door. So everything's going just swell when the unexplainable happens. I'm slapped square across the face mid-jerk. What the F? So here I am sitting on my toilet, the D in hand, trying to process what the crap just happened. I knew I didn't just imagine this, and I'm pretty creeped out at this point. I was so overwhelming confused I did the only thing I could, I finished. So I can only assume this ghost or whatever stared into my soul as it could see my vinegar strokes and was probably just as disgusted with me as I was. And yeah, it was weird. TLDR, ghost caught me beating my meat and I guess it didn't like what it saw. Story 28. Throwaway because I've told people this story before and it's pretty recognizable. My school's library is open until around 2 in the morning for the idiots like me who don't do their essays until the last minute. It's a pretty small building and most of the books are in the basement area called the stacks. Just to give you a quick layout, there's the big main stairs that go down to the stacks, a vending machine room, and the long hallway with 4 entrances into the stacks. The stacks are 2 really big rooms on opposite sides of the hallway with a huge amount of bookshelves and study desks lining the walls. I was there around 11 p.m. last year. It was a pretty research-intensive essay, so I was down in the stacks working in one of the study desks so I didn't have to keep going upstairs and downstairs again. I had been there for maybe 2 hours and everyone except for a boy working a few desks down from me had left already. I was pretty zoned out by this point. It was an 8 a.m. class, so I didn't have much time until it was due and I was sort of panicking, so it really pissed me off when I heard someone flipping through book pages really fast to make them do that loud noise at the other end of the room. I sort of ignored it for a while thinking they'd go away eventually, but they just kept doing it. After about 5 minutes, I got sick of it and started to walk over to tell them to knock it off. I get about 3 steps across the room and it just stopped. I sat back down and it was quiet again for like 10 more minutes before the flipping pages noise started again, only loads louder, like they'd grabbed a huge book that time. The boy started to get pissed off too and he stood up and started walking through the bookshelves trying to find them. It keeps going, so I got up too and started looking around with him. It got really loud and it was pretty obvious where it was coming from by that point, so we started walking towards it. He was on one side of the shelves and I was on the other. We walked all the way down the shelves. No one there. We hadn't seen anyone come in the stacks and we were on the side of the room with the entrances. No way could anyone have come in without us seeing them. The noise stopped again and we both just sort of slowly walked back to our seats. I assumed it was just a fan or something in the other room and I really needed to get my essay done. We sat down and immediately the noise started again. It sounded like it was coming from right next to the guy's chair. He shoved his stuff in his bag, looked at me, said, "Screw this," and took off. I was out of there maybe 5 seconds behind him. I still won't go back in the stacks at night, even when there's other people down there. No essay's worth getting ended by a weird book ghost. Story 29. Me and my friends were driving home from a show we all went to. This was about 7 years ago or so, in the Cerritos area. There's an elementary school there, I think on 186th, I forgot what it's called. Anyway, we drove by a local elementary school, all of us joking and laughing or whatever 16-year-olds do, and my friend's girlfriend looked over at the playground in the school, screamed, and refused to talk to anyone for a few hours. We all asked her what was wrong, what she saw, what happened, but nothing would make her tell us. We all thought she saw someone on the playground or a dead body or something. All we knew was that she was seriously spooked. As backstory, I should add that she's sensitive to paranormal happenings. I should also add that I don't really believe in ghosts or the like, but whatever. She would have doors fly open at her old house, clothes hangers fly off the rail, cups fall over and then right themselves multiple times. Just crazy crap. Anyway, she eventually told her boyfriend what she had seen. She said that she had briefly seen a bunch of blood-covered people walking around the playground aimlessly. I immediately started blaming exhaustion, as it was around 2 a.m. when we drove by. We looked it up later and it turns out that a plane had crashed into the school in the late 80s and a lot of people had died. Spooky music. Story 30. I worked in a nursing home as an aide in a hospice unit. One night I had 3 patients trying to die and my job was to ensure that they were comfortable. The girls that worked the floor with me at night were awesome. We would always try to make each other laugh and get through the night as best as we could. I was known for scaring girls. Sometimes I'd hide in the closet of a room where someone had recently died, their body and belongings long gone in the empty room, and I'd press the call light and wait. The girls would come in and hastily shut it off, but I'd always jump out and scare the crap out of them. One night I was in the nurse's station filling out a report since I had to give Ken some narcotics when an aide rushed in. She swore that she thought she saw my shadow on the wall as if I were hiding trying to scare her, but then she heard me laugh in the nurse's station. I decided to check it out since there wasn't supposed to be anyone on our floor. As I walked over to the wall I stood where the light would have created my shadow and there was nothing. I laughed it off until the CNA started shrieking and I turned around and a shadow seemingly rose up the wall from the ground out of nothing. I just stared at it and said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, is that the best you've got?" And walked back to the nursing station. A while later I had to do rounds. As I walked towards a patient's room I heard 3 knocks on the door that lead outside to the patio by their room and I saw an older gentleman dressed in all black. I couldn't let him in because I didn't have the access code, so I told him to hold on a moment and I would get the nurse to let him in. When she and I returned to the door he was gone. She went outside and we couldn't find him, so I continued to the patient's room to check on him. Blood everywhere and the patient is on the floor bleeding. He had tried to get up it appears and flopped around a bit in his blood trying to get up. The nurse lifted him back into the bed and we cleaned him up. There was nothing else we could do as he was DNR besides make sure he was comfortable. I went to my next patient's room and bam, dead. He had stopped breathing. I rushed to get the nurse and pulled his file. DNR also. We call the morgue and his family while I clean his body with an aide. I go to check on the patient that fell, vitals every 15 minutes for non-witnessed fall, and he's dead. I'm get the nurse, she's frustrated because this takes 2 aides off her floor to care for the deceased and lots of paperwork for her. As I'm walking down the hall for linens I see the OL man I originally saw outside walking past the nurse's station and he whispered, "One more Jack Mia, and then I'm done for the night, just one more." I jumped up because his whisper was so eerie and I run to the direction he was going. A patient's room door slammed shut and when I ran in she looked directly at me and took her last breath and died. Her eyes still staring directly at me. For some reason I remember her window being open and how odd it was. I ran to the window and didn't see anything and slammed it shut, checked the woman for a pulse and found nothing. The nurse had followed me and saw exactly what I saw and heard the voice whisper as I did. She was coming around a corner and swore she saw the man and then me jump up and run after him and, like me, saw the patient's room door slam crap before I could get in there. When I had turned around I saw the nurse standing in the doorway and she could only say, "I saw it too, oh my god, I saw it too." TL, doctor worked as a med aide in hospice ward and nurse and I ran around while death showed himself and took his time to end 3 of our patients in one night. Story 31. About a month ago, I was flying down to Texas to visit a close friend and it was about 8:30 so it was dusk. The sun was shining inside the plane so most everyone had the sliding blinds down. Anyway, out of nowhere I had the urge to look out the window, so go ahead and do so. Immediately I looked down to see the view and out of nowhere probably 400 to 500 feet below the plane a small jet/missile looking object flies by extremely fast. It was man-made because it had decals and was jet black, but it lacked wings and barely looked large enough to hold a single person. It flew in the opposite direction of the plane, and I saw the jet stream it left behind longer than I saw the actual object. I remember saying whoa and looking around to see if anyone saw the same thing I did, to no avail. Still have no idea what I saw. It's not exactly creepy but extremely strange, and a little unsettling. Story 32. A few years ago I went to a Christmas party. That night my housemates went home earlier while I decided to stay and get in the Christmas spirit with a few other friends. I ended up getting pretty hammered and got home around 3 a.m. Instead of going straight to bed, I got another beer inside, then went out the back porch to have a smoke and look at the stars. I was outside a couple of minutes when I see the light go on in the kitchen. My housemate comes out and look at me out the back. I wave and generally look like a drunk idiot. I thought he was going to come out and get a debrief on the rest of the evening, as there were some good laughs we had not relevant to this story. Anyway, he just gets a glass of water and goes to bed. I finish my smoke and beer, and so do I. The next morning we're rehashing the previous night when he mentions getting up and seeing me having a smoke out the back. Who came back from the party with you last night? I give him a sideways look and reply, no one dude, I was out there alone. He insists, nah man, there was someone out there with you, behind you on the porch, when you were looking inside waving. I didn't come out cause I thought it was some random friend from the Christmas party I didn't know, couldn't be bothered making introductions. To this day he stands by this version of events. Whoever it was must have been standing close behind me the whole time. I saw no one and heard nothing. Gives me the willies every time I think about it. Story 33. I'm late to the party but I'll share anyways. When I was a teenager I was big into skateboarding and building ramps and crap. There was a neighborhood being built behind mine and I'd go over there on the weekends and get scrap wood and bring it back to my house. You had to go through a little bit of woods and cross a creek to get there. I went one day by myself, and when I crossed the creek and started walking through the woods to the construction site I could hear a man talking. I stood still to try to hear what he was saying. It was getting louder as if he was coming through the woods towards me, and I finally heard what he was saying, and he made a little jingle singing, "I'm gonna get you." I couldn't hear any leaves crunching and I never saw anyone. I ran and was slipping while I was trying to climb up the muddy bank in the creek. I don't believe in ghosts or anything, but that's one thing that stuck with me that I can't explain. Story 34. When I was 2 years old my uncle committed a double criminal and ended his life. He was a meth head and had been taking money from my grandmother, and finally one day she told him no more. That just happened to be the day I was at their house. He went to his room and brought out a shotgun. He shot my grandfather in his face. My grandmother ran and grabbed me. He shot her in the back. She dropped me and rolled over. He pulled out a big knife and hit her in the neck with it. He then turned his attention to me. I remember this vividly. I was crying and he picked me up, rocked me for a minute and sat me in my swing. He pointed the shotgun right at my face. Then all of a sudden he just stopped. Like something was fighting with him. Like physically prevented him from blowing me into a million parts. Next thing I know the gun is in his mouth and bang. That is all I remember. My parents never told me a single thing about it, and up until a year ago they didn't know I knew about it. When I told my dad, he starts crying and tells me how I was just swinging in my swinger like someone was pushing me. I had forgotten about it until I was like 13, and all of a sudden I remembered. It messed with my head for a while. Story 35. I've told this one on here before, but here it goes again. So about 5 years ago, some friends and I went camping in Oconee State Park in South Carolina. We were in high school and went with our school ROTC instructor. This guy was in his 50s but still a ox. He was a sergeant major while in the army and was the definition of badass. So, the first night camping it was really cold, so we decided to sleep around the fire. We woke up all at same time in the middle of the night to the smell of wet dog and rotten flesh. We decided it might just be the damp leaves and we sleep through the rest of the night. Well, we wake up the next morning and there were paw prints all over the place. I'm not talking just around the outskirts of the site, I mean there were paw prints 4 feet away from where I laid my head that night. We were all pretty creeped out, so we decided to head into town to get some lunch. We stayed in town the rest of the day and headed back to the site around dusk. My friends and I are in the back of the truck as we drive down the gravel road to the site. Then all of a sudden, Sergeant Major slammed on the brakes and we came to a stop in the middle of the road. We all jumped up and looked over the cab to see what it was. Standing in the middle of the road was a hairless animal, around 50 pounds, standing on its hind legs. While still on its back legs, it walked to the side of the road and let out this god-awful screeching noise. It darted into the woods and left us all frozen in fear. Then we smelt it. It was the same terrible smell from the night before. We got into the cab and I saw Sergeant Major like I had never seen him. I was absolutely terrified. The animal/creature we saw shook him to his core. We drove in silence for the rest of the ride back to the site. When we got there, he told us that we were leaving and to pack everything up. None of us have been back since, and Sergeant Major won't let ROTC camp there anymore. We agreed that what we saw looked like a mix between a bobcat and a coyote, but walked like a bear on its back legs. We named it the Catiote. A few of my friends who hadn't heard the story decided to go up there one day and said the entire area gave off a really creepy vibe and decided to leave. After I told them the story, it sealed the deal that none of us will be going back.